Cynicism is just another form of cowardice.
Give the face for a reason.
Where our sergeants are not interested in our midlife crisis, we were to do our frickin' work.
Well, I mean, let's be honest.
Hello, everyone. I'm Carson Honeycutt.
And I'm Garrett Cross.
And we want to thank you for joining us for episode 7 of the Spotlight Podcast. And on this podcast, it is our job to break down and analyze preeminent members of the military and veteran community, to discover their habits, their mindsets, their tactics, etc., so that you can take those and apply them to your life post-military. Those members range from military members to military spouses and to civilians who are just avid supporters of the military. And today we have a special treat for you, because we are sitting down with chaos personified, General James Mattis. Thank you so much for joining us, General.
Sure, happy to be here.
So let's just jump right in. Garrett, I think you can get us started off, because you have a very important question for the General.
Yeah, so General, you have 41 years plus in the Marine Corps and in the public sector, you know, doing the work of the people. And then you transitioned from that position, from that warfighter mentality, into the Secretary of Defense. And we were curious on how your perspective changed. Did it change at all? And how did you maintain that, maybe how you maintain that warfighter personality and persona going from those roles?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because we're all built on our formative experience. And I think in the case of being tapped on the shoulder, and being asked to do a job I'd never aspired to, never sought out, never anticipated, I had to sit back and think, now what can I use based on what I've learned over the many years, and what do I have to change? Because the circumstance changes. The result was that I determined that where at one time I basically gave my best input on where to or how to deploy troops, now I had to determine whether or not it was the right thing to do. In other words, it was no longer a cheery aye, aye, sir in the naval service. When you'd had your input, you actually had to compose the policy. And the reason was I had a handwritten note that I put on my desk, my stand-up desk, and basically what I did was ask the question every time I signed a deployment order for one Air Force squadron, one Navy ship, one Army infantry company, one Marine special operations unit, every time I deployed them. And these deployment orders came in under civilian control of the military, probably somewhere around 30 a week. And I had the questionnaire that said, does this deployment, does this commitment contribute sufficiently to the well-being of the American people to justify these troops dying? Not to go in harm's way, not to possibly be injured. Would deploying these troops be sufficiently advantageous to the American people that if they died, it was worth it? And I wanted to answer yes to each one of those, and now I'd completely shifted from a can-do military attitude to a should-we-do civilian attitude, if that answers your question yet.
It does, General. Thank you. The follow-up to that then what do you think veterans can do, because you have so many folks that are leaving the military that are maybe not necessarily leaving from that strategic, high-up leadership kind of perspective that you are, but maybe they're a crew chief. And how do you maybe convey that kind of persona and perspective to those folks that are leaving, maybe not necessarily from those higher roles?
Look, kind of a tenet of the Marine Corps, and I was on recruiting duty twice, and I was taught this, was you hire for attitude and you train to skill. Everybody who joins the military today is a volunteer. They look past all the hot political rhetoric and they rally to the flag, say, I'm going in. Now, some may want to do it for the GI Bill, But there's other ways to get GI money or college money than going into the Army. They may want to do it because they want adventure. But at the bottom line, when you go in and you sign a blank check payable with your life to defend this country, the qualities, the attributes, the character of someone who's willing to do that sums up what every business in America needs. It needs devoted employees. It needs people who understand about a mission. It needs young people who have the initiative to get off their duff and go do something for someone else. The character you bring to any organization makes you valuable. We could teach a monkey 90% of the actual habits that are needed in a marketplace. The most important thing to have is this attitude, this can-do attitude that every veteran has. It's also an attitude that says, you don't claim victimhood, you don't claim cynicism. Cynicism is just another form of cowardice. You say, oh, it's so bad, nothing can help, to heck with it. That's just cowardice in the military. Every time we choose the attitude we're going to have. No company in America could fail by hiring a veteran unless the veteran sells himself or herself short.
I 100% agree with that, General.
That's good, Garrett. We're looking at promoting you.
Yeah. He's a yes man. So I think that leads very well, General Mattis, to the next question. And you were talking just then about the cynicism that goes along with a bad mindset and how that actually affects people and what you can potentially be hiding behind. And you're one of the few people that I have seen in the mainstream, beyond small pockets of people, that it's talking about this concept of post-traumatic growth versus post-traumatic stress disorder. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that for people that may not be aware of it? Yeah,
I mean, there is the potential to come out damaged from the military, but generally, I think it was General Sherman who, I may be wrong on that, who said that combat makes good men better and bad men worse. Because of the kind of people who gravitate to the U.S. military, the men and women who do so, they're fundamentally good. There's a lot easier ways to go in this world than signing up for the U.S. Air Force or the U.S. Navy, U.S. Coast Guard, Army, Marines. So the kind of people who come in are basically good people. And I've seen people come out of just horrific combat, and they're better human beings, they're kinder human beings, they make better husbands, they make better fathers, they make more committed members of their school district or of their parish, their synagogue, their mosque. There is no reason to assume that it's somehow a disaster for your future. Now, it is not an insignificant moment for those who go into what we call the intimate killing, the close combat. That is tough. The first time you shoot your fellow man, you're not going to be the same after that. However, there is a healing that comes with time, and I think most of all, this issue is summed up by something the Canadian forces do. They fly their troops out of the Middle East to Cyprus. There they turn in their ammunition, clean everything up, get their gear ready for turning and all, and then they're flown into Ontario to an air base there. And then the first thing they do, I understand, is they're shown a movie that says it's okay to be okay. That in fact, in many of the democracies today, we've so inculcated our troops with this disease or disorder orientation that we've forgotten that there's actually a healthy orientation that can come out of service, even in combat. And so if you come at life always looking for the disease, for the disorder, for the victim, that sort of thing, you're going to probably find it and categorize people along those lines. But if you come out of it from a health, variations of health, then you have people who actually start looking at the experiences they've had, put them in context and say, I'm better because of those experiences. It's growth. It's only disorder for a very small percentage. And that percentage, it's sometimes even pre-service conditions where they've had struggles dealing with life. But I don't think that post-traumatic disorder or disease characterizes even a small percentage of veterans. It's infinitesimal. Now, if we spend enough time and money rewarding people. I know when I went through the screening, the young person who looked at my book didn't know my rank. I was dressed in a suit like you are today. And he said, "My gosh, you've been in a lot of wars." I said, "Well, yeah, I've been lucky to be in a lot of fights." And he said, "Well, you must have post-traumatic stress, post-traumatic disorder." I said, "No, I don't think so." And he said, "Well, you can get money for it, and it's tax-free." I said, "Well, yeah, but if I don't have it, I don't have it." He said, "Well, you must have bad dreams." And I said, "Well, of course, once in a while you have bad dreams about combat." But I said, "I have worse dreams about, when I was 5 years old, those guys who lived under my bed, and I didn't want my dad to turn the bedroom light out at night, And we all laugh about that sort of thing, as we should. So I'm not trying to make light of those who truly went through horrific circumstances. But I think we're getting to the point now where we're characterizing everybody as variations of disease or disorder. And eventually we pay them for it, and eventually they can actually start believing that crap.
What impact do you think that it would have on the community as a whole if we moved more towards that growth mindset as opposed to the disease mindset?
Yeah, I read an interesting book by Sebastian Junger about tribes and about what happens when people come home. I think one of the things that all of us miss about the military, and this includes going back to my day when a fair number of us were draft-oriented, draft-motivated. I mean, we were signing up because we knew we had to go. It wasn't an all-volunteer force. But even those men today, women looking back on it, remember fondly the camaraderie, the togetherness, the teamwork. And I think when people get out of the military, in any industrialized society, this is true for the United Kingdom, it's true for France, I know troops from Australia, certainly many from America, you never really find the intensity of the friendships, of the comradeship, of the appreciation for one another, of the trust in one another, that just one nod from one to the other, and he's going to get up shooting and cover you as you move forward. You trust them and know them in ways probably even better than you know your own family members. And so you come out of that to a society where people, if you drive through neighborhoods now, no one's out in the yard playing. They're all inside watching their own television or their own little screen. We have more and more people who are connected more electronically than physically, that sort of thing. And I think alienation has a lot to do with the way we relate to one another or don't relate to one another in this post-industrial age, this information age. And that, I think, creates much of the sense of aloneness. And in life, like if you look at how the Japanese look at life as basically a spiritual battle for your own improvement, your own development, for your community's development, you can lose a lot of battles if you try to fight them alone. Only Hollywood has Rambos. Everywhere else in a war, as you guys know, you've been there, you always have your team. That's how you survive. So now we come back and we come at it from a disease orientation when in fact what it is a sense of loneliness, I think, more than anything else, missing those old relationships in the military.
So what can a veteran do if they're going through that aloneness or they've fallen into that?
Yeah.
What can they do to move out?
Yeah, what a great point. Great question, because, okay, so what? What do you do about it? We were all part of the executive branch. We do things. We don't pontificate about it. Great question. The first thing I would say is get a buddy. It doesn't matter if if you were in the Marines, Carson, and you were in the Air Force, Gary. I mean, find a buddy and start working out every morning again. Go back to Confucius, build yourself up, body, mind, and spirit. It worked for Confucius, it'll work for us today. And start working out again every morning. I don't understand the number of overweight veterans. I'll be frank about it. We were not that way when we were soldiers once and young. We were fit. So start physically and start working out with at least one other buddy, draw in some civilians too, bring in some of the guys and gals who've served and all laugh about getting up early in the morning and going out and working out. And then have something you're doing where you take responsibility for your own development. Carson, you were in the Marines. Every Marine has to read certain books when they come in. And then when you make corporal or sergeant, you get a new list of books. And when you make major, you get a new set of books. Generals, when they get promoted to general, they're told, congratulations, you'll never eat poorly again. By the way, here's your list of new books to read. So make certain that you don't just wait for college to tell you what you need to know. Take responsibility for your own mental development. And so between the body and the mind, the physical working out and getting back into good shape, and then the mental development in the direction you want to go, you're the master of your future, then the spiritual side cannot be forgotten. And there, whether it's in the church or the synagogue or the mosque, or it's with your buddies, swimming every Sunday morning down there and talking about what you're going to do with your life, find some kind of spiritual reinforcement. And this is the way you do things. Remember, if you do things, that changes the way you look at life. But if you just sit there and gripe about it, or you start sucking your thumb, then that's probably not going to change a whole lot.
So, kind of on top of that, General, I think you hit it a nail on the head when folks leave the military. We leave this tight-knit group of people, and where the bonds that you share, even among veterans who have never met, or until Carson and I met, we had never worked together. But there is that common link, that common bond. And I think some of the struggles for a lot of vets coming out is the free market, the civilian side, looks at us or each other as coworkers and employees and employers, but we looked at one another as brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest transition. So I think that whole body and mind spirit is such an important piece of that. But I guess my follow-up would be how do we impose that almost on a civilian side who maybe doesn't have that same perspective? You know, it's one thing to do it amongst ourselves, but it's almost another for others to adopt it as an organizational method.
Yeah. First, I would remove the word impose. I know what you're trying to say there, but I would look at it that leadership is really example, and just reverse it. Example is leadership. It's almost like an algebraic equal sign. Example equals leadership. They're one and the same thing. The way George Washington did it, remember, he had a revolutionary army. He didn't have a disciplined army. These were guys, they were free men. They were free. They didn't take orders from anybody. And now they're suddenly in a military where you've got to have someone make the decision. You've got to be able to fight as a team. And his approach was, it almost sounds monotonous, but he used it repeatedly as I study Washington's style. And it was, first he would listen, then he would learn, then he would help, and then he would lead. So if you're in a civilian environment, there are guys and gals in that environment who want to, for example, work out each day. And you can start by just walking with them at noon instead of going to the cafeteria and hogging down another pizza and putting on extra weight, Not to keep going on about this physical fitness, but I find that physical fitness is ennobling and liberating to the mental and spiritual part as well, is why I go back to it. But if you listen to those around you, the example of veterans is often referred to by young people who decide to join the military because a veteran was working in their organization. It's referred to by CEOs who talk to me, who say, how can I hire more veterans? These are the most reliable employees I've got. I think that if you can set the example and listen to others and see where they're at, learn from them, learn what they need, and then you help them. You say, well, why don't you start jogging with me in the morning? Or why don't we start a book club? And we all read a book and we come in and talk about it, every Monday afternoon, at the end of working hours, something like that. And you start creating that cohesion that was there before. And now you're leading by example, okay? So listen, learn. That shows respect for other people. And then help them. People, no one makes it in this world alone. Everyone needs mates. Everyone needs friends. Everyone needs comrades in arms, shipmates in the naval service. We all need them. And then your leadership flows.
In general, what impact do you think that would have on civilian perceptions of not only veterans, but the military community as a whole, if that was actually our mindset?
I think that, number one, having been in the military, you mentioned all those years. Really, I came in 1969. There were places where we were encouraged not to wear a uniform in the country because we were not welcome. And when I look at the way in airports everyone stands aside for uniformed military to go on the airplane first, I mean, how many times have you and I, once they realize we're veterans, been thanked for our service? I mean, I almost feel uncomfortable because I think the only reason I stuck around that low-paying outfit was to serve with people like you. I could have made a lot more money somewhere else. I considered it a privilege to fight for America. So when I was thanked for that, I always felt a little awkward. And corporal, like I was an infantry officer, and most of our training really is at the hands of young NCOs. It's the corporals, the sergeants, the staff sergeant, the gunnery sergeant who make or break you as an infantry officer. And a Corporal Kyle Carpenter, a friend of mine, Medal of Honor winner, youngest Medal of Honor winner alive today, taught me this. He was listening as an immigrant, was talking about his life before he came to America and after he arrived in America. And when that guy thanked him for his service, Kyle had stopped reading in the back seat and really listening to him here. Again, you see George Washington's way of leading just coming out. You know, once you see this, you see it in action all the time by good leaders. And he said, "You're worth it." And I think that the change that we would see would be almost strategic, Carson. In other words, how many times have we been hearing that in the body politic, Republican and Democrats don't even go to lunch together anymore, that people have lost good friends over this sort of thing? What if all of our veterans, when thanked for their service, would show that how much they appreciated their service and they appreciate the other? And don't ask, who did you vote for? Don't look at whether they're male or female. Don't look at whether they're black, white, red, brown, yellow, whatever. Just say, you're worth it. Every American was worth us fighting what you guys did for those couple of years. And me, I was a slow learner, a little more years. The country was worth it. And just turn it around when they thank you and say, you're worth it. And all of a sudden, it's going to change the whole unity of the country, I believe, because they're going to see that we believe in them. and we believe in them, and we don't care who they voted for. We don't care who they go to bed with. We're not into that stuff. This is a free country, and we protect this great big experiment we call America, and that's what it's all about. So turn it around, and I think it would be a way to help bring our country back together, which is why I say it would have a strategic effect.
Absolutely, and I agree with that. And I'm going to switch track. I've got my list of questions here, but that brings me to a point. Back in, I want to say it was about 2016, there was a petition going around to have you run for president, and you said no, because it's time for the next generation to step up and do that. And I believe that there are a lot of veterans who want to do that. What would be your advice for them into stepping into more civic leadership, into that unifying role?
Probably one of the things I enjoyed most about testifying in front of Congress, and I was one who did enjoy it. I believe in the Congress. I believe in I've got this love affair with the U.S. Constitution, and I used to enjoy seeing the effect of young veterans now sitting in the committees, grilling me when I was a lieutenant general, a four-star general, commander of Central Command, commander of Joint Forces Command, Secretary of Defense. And the reason I enjoyed it was the veterans are much more apt to work across the aisle from the other party. They approach it with a seriousness that means that, generally speaking, they seem to do their homework more before they ask the questions. The normal kind of I would call it preparation that we would expect from one another in our line of work, that our formative years in the military, where our sergeants were not interested in our midlife crisis. We were to do our frickin' work, you know? And so I think that the more we can see young veterans not wait till they have my color hair, and for those of you listening, it's gray, but get out there, do your homework, listen to guys like me. We're no smarter than you. We've got more experiences because we've been around longer. But run for school board, run for city council. That's where most of what affects people's lives, that's where most of those decisions are made. Don't wait until you're old or something like that. And I realize, you're going to school, you're raising a family, you're just starting up the corporate ladder or whatever. But you can find time. And if by doing so, You bring the warrior ethos, not the yelling out obscenities or that sort of thing, but the real warrior ethos of finding problems, defining problems, solving problems, rolling up your sleeves, working with each other. Then what you in effect do is you bring the example of veterans in the finest tradition of our country, because veterans have done this. They came home from World War II in the horrific fighting. They didn't suck their thumb. They went to college on the GI Bill, and they eventually rose to be presidents of universities, corporate CEOs. You can do this. But it's a noble job what we're doing here. We're building the country here. It's not built. We're building it here. And we need the young veterans with their sense of service, with their formative experiences to come in and be part of this, local level, state level, national level.
Absolutely. And so to do that, you talk a lot about in your book about creating allies.
Mm-hmm.
And no doubt the political landscape of America is a little bizarre right now. If you find yourself as a veteran wanting to go out and do those things, but you're struggling to create allies, or maybe there's a roadblock, how would you recommend that they handle that?
Yeah, I did have the privilege of getting to fight and deploy over many, many years for the country. And I can honestly say I never fought once in an all-American formation. It was always with allies. When I commanded, I was in the Marines like you were, Carson. I had an infantry battalion, and our job was to open the path through 2 obstacle belts full of mines, barbed wire, you name it. It was horrible. And in my battalion, I had probably around 1,100 Marines, around 7,500 sailors, 75 to 100 sailors, and 50 Arabs, Kuwaitis who'd been caught in school back in the States at the time their country was invaded, and they were assigned to us. They loved being with the Marines. They just thought it was the craziest bunch of people they'd ever been around, but they enjoyed it. They were great. But guess what, too? They knew their country, and they knew how to help guide us as we got up into the airport area to free the capital city and all. So they were worth their weight in gold. And every time I've fought, it's been like this. I've fought alongside Syrian troops, believe it or not, Mujahideen. I've fought alongside 49 nations troops in Afghanistan. And we are always stronger if we have allies in life, whether it be on the national level like that, or on the individual level. You always need allies. You need team players. And again, I would fall back to the way George Washington would listen and learn. And what did he learn? He learned what the French troops would bring to these inexperienced farmers and all Americans who were up against the best army in the world, the Redcoats, who would humble Napoleon just a few years later. And he learned from them. And then he helped his own troops, and pretty soon he's leading our troops into battles, and we have a country thanks to the Revolutionary Army. I think for young veterans getting out of the military, college campuses, starting jobs, and this sort of thing, is make certain you find people whose values are similar to yours. They don't have to be the same, but at least there's a compatibility. You don't want to make allies with the wrong people. You can fall in with the wrong crowd. But once you do so, you're going to find opportunities to help them too. And as you do that, you start building teamwork. And I've seen a couple of young veterans in Silicon Valley take a startup that had a great idea but had no sense of teamwork. And those young veterans very quickly became the gel that pulled everybody together. And they were actually in some rather rudimentary early entry-level positions. And yet today they've risen quite high in the ranks because of the character they had and their ability to build teams. And I think that is something that's almost a natural to the kind of person who gravitates to the military in the first place.
Yeah, on top of that, General, just the one thing that I'd kind of taken away from my limited experience, but my spouse obviously being in the civilian side, is the one thing we see on the outside when we come into the civilian world is a lot of times people get promoted because they're very good at their jobs, and then they get promoted to a position now where they're in charge of other folks. Mm-hmm. But no one ever teaches them how to do that.
Yeah.
They know how to do their job specifically, but they're never taught how to manage people. And this is when we get micromanagers and not leaders. We listen to them and we follow their instructions, but we would never follow them, you know. And being in, maybe if a veteran's on the bottom half of that and they're dealing with those kind of employers who maybe don't have that perspective, how do we make allies on that front? It's one thing to listen and lead amongst ourselves, but how do we help our organizations have that kind of that listen, learning, and then leading by example?
Well, each corporate culture is different. So you'd have to look at what are the opportunities in each one, or do what we call in the military, do your preparation, your reconnaissance, and look at it. It's an interesting question because I was asking a young officer that had gotten out of the Marines, and I went and visited him. He got out as a captain, and he'd gone to work for a very good company, was rapidly picked up in their executive program, which meant accelerated promotion and all. And I asked him, what's the biggest difference between when you were an artillery officer in the Marines and where you're at now? And he very successful. And he sat back there from the table for a minute. He said, two things. He said, one, there's no command screening program. And he said, you know how we were used to, it'd be a year of training before an officer even stood in front of troops. And then after about 4 years, you had to go to school for another year. And then about 4 or 5 years, you had to go to school for another year. He said in the military, they look at personnel costs as investments. And many civilian corporations look at them as overhead. And that's a fundamental difference. So I said, well, why is it that you're so successful? You're in an accelerated executive program that they move you around the company to various headquarters so you know all the business units so that they're obviously grooming you. He said, I talk to them all the time about how you write commander's intent. How do you say, here is my aim? How do you clearly state that to the people you're working with, whether it be 5 people in an R&D team or 100 on the production line? And then how do you set up the feedback that allows them to then use their initiative and use their aggressiveness and go to work? And the more I talked about it, the more people asked me about it. And the more they asked me about it, the more people started buying into this idea that the people who come to work want to do a good job. So make it very clear what they need to do, what the goal is, and then clarify that they understand it. Have them feed back to you what they think they heard from you, and then wander around, talk to them, make certain you're getting feedback loops, but take your hands off the steering wheel and let other people use their initiative. And the next thing you know, you have everybody feels like they own the mission as much as anyone else. And now when opportunities exist to improve the production line, to speed up the research, they're taking advantage of it because they know what you want them to do. So I think there's a way where you explain about the clarity of the objective that we all had in the military and see if you can parlay that into something that applies to your corporate setting, to your corporate culture. They're all different. I've actually found some corporations that are even more decentralized decision making. They've delegated to even lower levels than we do in the military. So there's some out there like that. Many of them, however, do keep a lot of decision making at high levels. That's just not good for a competitive organization.
Okay. In general, you talk along those lines about the impacts that veterans can have once they're in there and they're influencing people. You also talk a lot about maverick thinkers.
Yeah.
How can you, as a veteran, display your maverick thinking without giving off the tone of, I'm just here to change everything that you're doing because I think everything sucks?
I think the most important thing is that you define the problem that needs to be solved and spend enough time defining the problem that everyone agrees on that. And then, I'll give you an example. I think it was Einstein, I'm not sure about this. He said, if I had 1 hour, he's asked, if you had 1 hour to save the world, how would you compose your thinking? And he said, I would spend 55 minutes defining the problem, and I'd save the world in 5 minutes. You see, if you don't spend time defining the problem up front, there's no way people are going to accept your solution. The second point is the Mavericks I talk about saving are never doing it for ego or for arrogance or for ignorant reasons. They didn't do their homework, or they just want to lord it over people, or it's for their own purpose of advancement. In other words, if you define the problem as something that the corporation needs done, if you show how the corporation can get even faster traction for its new product line or something, you do your homework, then when people sign up for it, they'll buy it. Now, sometimes even then, Mavericks will cause problems. The reason they were so important in the military to protect is the military necessarily is a conservative organization, because when things go wrong, people die. And people can talk all they want about being liberated and thinking out of the box. When someone's going to pay with their life for your thought out of the box, you better make darn certain that that is based on some real positive, rigorous problem identification. I think that what you have to do is protect those guys, because if you don't, you can be so aligned on your objective, you're no longer questioning, is that the right thing to do, and is this the right way to do it? So you keep these guys around because it's better than having the enemy show you you got it wrong. You'll never get it 100% right. What is critical is you do not get it 100% wrong. And that's where the Mavericks can help you.
Okay. And you talked about just that Mavericks as problem solvers and making sure, and to sum it up, would it be accurate to say basically protecting you from your own blind spots?
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to put it, because you can get so fixated on what you're doing that you ignore contrary impulses coming in. And I've done it before. I mean, I've done it because I was tired. I've done it because I've done this before. I know what I'm doing. And you didn't recognize that something had changed, fundamentally had changed. I mean, I walked an infantry battalion right into being surrounded in the open desert. Now, that is almost impossible to do, okay? That is almost impossible. I managed to do it. And my troops, you know you're not a real smart commander when your troops get out, pile out of their vehicles, setting up 4 mortar tubes pointing north and 4 mortar tubes pointing south. You know that wasn't a real bright move. And so once in a while, you have to have someone there who's almost acting like a Maverick sentinel, saying, are you sure you know what you're doing right now? And fortunately, the kind of guys, at least in the Marine Corps that sign up, are quite willing to challenge senior officers very bluntly. And so generally speaking, I was taught a lot by listening to the young guys on point, and I learned that if a 19-year-old Lance Corporal, when I was a lieutenant, a 19-year-old Lance Corporal turned around on point, looks you in the eye and says, sir, we're screwed. Take it to the bank. You're in trouble. Okay?
Absolutely. And if we could, let's go back to the defining the problem. And there's a quote that you had put in your book that the problems that bear directly on the future of civilization cannot be disposed of by general talk, vague formulae, pernicious abstractions, and they require concrete solutions. Mm-hmm. And specifically for definite and extremely complicated questions. What process can you go through to define the problem to make sure that it is tight?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways that I would do this. One is I would quantify the problem to the degree I could. Now, when you get up on the strategic level, you may only be able to quantify 20% of the problem statement, but you have to do that. Now, and sometimes at lower levels, more tactical issues, you can quantify 75%. And by doing that, by not being lazy, by knowing how to use mathematics and physics and this sort of thing, you're comfortable taking into account those things that can be counted. The higher you go, what counts most is the most difficult to count. So you kind of get into an inverse situation. So start by quantifying the problem to the degree you can, and refine your ability to know when to switch from quantifiable decision-making to non-quantifiable. When do you apply your military judgment, in my case, or your business judgment, your experience? The second point I would make is that studying history, it gives you a big, vast early warning system. And if you read enough history, It doesn't tell you what to do in each case, but it helps to light the dark path ahead, I call it. I read that somewhere. I don't have any original thoughts, by the way. What it allows you to do is to understand how other people in history have dealt with similar situations, successfully or unsuccessfully. And by doing that, you do not get caught flat-footed. For example, I had read enough about fighting that one night after 9/11, a 3-star admiral leans across a table with me, and late at night, I'm a 1-star, and he said, the enemy's going to fall back from up in northern Afghanistan to the south, and they're going to get stronger as they fall back because they're reinforcing their positions. They're actually going to be tougher. He said, now, can you get the Marines from the Mediterranean Fleet and the Pacific Fleet, go 350 nautical miles inland, and land them and move against Kandahar? I said, yeah, I can do that. He said, okay, I'll give you an airplane. Gave me a great anti-submarine airplane with beautiful telescopes on it. And we went up and we circled over Afghanistan. And as clearly as I can see you two sitting here right now, I could see the fighting up north in Afghanistan. I could see it over to further to the east. And I saw this big dark area to the south. And I knew it didn't matter how brave their boys were. I didn't care how many tanks they had or anything like that. Their generals were so dumb, I knew what I was going to do them because I'd studied in history and I could see what they'd done and the fatal flaw they had in their planning that thought that that desert was safe because it was a big old desert. And to me, it was an avenue of approach. So they were going to pay. So if you study history and you can bring history's lessons to bear to a problem where you've quantified it and then applied your judgment, and that's where you've got to put it on the line. At that point, you're either going to be right or wrong. And that's what leaders do. They make those kind of decisions once they have the right inputs, or as much input as they can get with the time they have. And then you make the decision, and then you give it 100%.
Awesome. So let's tie that into our last question for you, General. So it seems to most people, and I think that Garrett and I both agree on this, that America has a bit of an identity crisis. And how do we quantify a problem like that? What concrete steps can veterans take to help with that?
Yeah, it's an interesting way you just phrased it, an identity crisis. You know, kind of what do we stand for? Just as important, what will we not stand for? And I think that it is. I would not argue with you about that, although I don't think it's that deep of a crisis. Maybe an identity challenge or an identity problem, but I think that the way we teach history today, hyphenated history, you know, we have we have black history, we have women's history, we have Native American history, we have all these hyphenated histories. I see more and more history classes seem to be only about the powerless, that does need to be taught, but we also need to study the history of the powerful to understand what impacts us. Diplomatic history, military history. When I hear that military history isn't offered in a lot of colleges, they don't really want to study that war stuff. That's right. It'd be like if I went to a medical school and I heard someone say, "Well, cancer's really bad. We're not going to study that in medical school." I mean, we'd laugh about that, and yet it's no laughing matter that right now many Americans are unaware that America made the single most self-sacrificial pledge in world history after World War II, and I'll bet neither one of you could put it in words right now. I had to have myself a foreign ambassador teach me this. Basically, after World War II, hundreds of thousands of Americans dead, we make a pledge to save democracy in Western Europe, pledging 100 million dead Americans in a thermonuclear war in order to keep the Soviet army out of Western Europe, and the Cold War ensues. It took a foreigner to show me what we had done in those days. He said, "You could have said, Europe, that's twice in 25 years you drew us into one of your stupid wars. We're through with you. We're going to deal with Latin America and Asia. We're going to deal with Africa and the Middle East. We're done. You're on your own." He said, "Instead, you saved democracy in Western Europe. It took a foreign ambassador to show me just how generous and valiant America was. I can take that question, and I have done so, into some of the finest colleges in this country and say, when did America make a pledge that was the single most self-sacrificial pledge in world history? And not one person can answer the question. So we're going to have to go back to teaching our history, not to condemn those who were not perfect before, who were not thinking like we are now, but to recognize how this country keeps getting better all the time. And if we recognize that, then the words of a PhD, a young Marine who was a corporal in World War II, a guy named E.B. Sledge, who fought in Okinawa and Peleliu. And E.B. Sledge, as a young 19-year-old Marine, said the country didn't have to be perfect. If it was worth living in, it was worth fighting for. And so this great big experiment that you and I call America, and that's all it is, an experiment to see if we can have a government of the people and by the people and for the people survive. If we would understand how every generation is out to make it to turn the country over in as good a shape or better than they found it, then we would understand the imperfections of our country before and how much patriots have fought to make us a better country, a kinder country, a country more inclusive. And without declaring war on each other, as Lincoln put it, even in the tail end of the Civil War, the bloodiest war in our history, with malice for none, with charity for all. Let's roll up our sleeves and make it better. And that's, I think, the real answer to this, that we've simply got to recognize that this country is our country and we're still building it here.
Outstanding. General Mattis, thank you so much for joining us today. Hey everyone, thanks again for listening to another episode of the Spotlight Podcast. And I just wanted to take a second to ask you who you think should be interviewed on the show. Who do you think is out there that's just absolutely crushing it that the veteran population needs to hear from? That's what we want to hear from you. Send us your suggestions to spotlight@thezenveteran.com. That's SPOTLIGHT @thezenveteran.com. Thanks again for listening.